So thank you everyone for sticking it out here in the open source journey room at the Practical Open Source Information Conference brought to you by the Open Source Initiative. My name is Remy DeCosmaker, and I'll be your friendly neighborhood moderator today. And as we get started, our third speaker today is Amanda Casari. She is an open source scientist with the Google Open Source Program Office, and her talk is entitled The Business Impact of Open Source. But before she gets started, I wanted to send another round of thank yous to our sponsors, OSI, Red Hat, Google, Reblaze, Collabora, Perio, GNOME, FreeBSD, and Blindside. And of course, if you have any questions or comments for our speaker, please text them into the public chat. And let's give Amanda a nice warm welcome. Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, thank you. And I'm just going to imagine everybody else out there hopefully getting a cup of coffee or tea or water, and also maybe taking a break since I can't see all of you. It's so nice to be with you here today. Thanks for coming to today's session on the business impact of open source. I'm very excited to be with you. And because
we don't see your slides yet, Amanda.
You can't see my slides at all?
Not yet. I believe you have to. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Heather sees them.
Yeah. So I didn't
see Deb's
upload
slides,
them.
so...
I chose to share my presentation.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. All right. If anybody cannot see them, please let us know. So today, if you prefer to follow along with the transcript and slides separately, you can find them at this link. So it's at bit.ly/POSI-2021-business-impact. It also has speaker notes and alt text if you need those for any of the tools that you work with. I did see we have closed captioning. Thank you so much, OSI. But if you want to follow up, then these will be available there as we continue. So hello, my name is Amanda Casari, and I'm getting used to a camera being in different places, so just excuse the way my head turns. I'm a white woman with light hair and eyes, and I usually wear glasses like I am today. I'm currently an open source scientist at Google's Open Source Programs Office, where I lead Google's research and engineering work with Project Ocean. We explore open source with an ecosystems and complex networks lens. And this year I was named external faculty to the Vermont Complex Systems Center. I serve as an advisor for a few organizations, including Open Source Community Africa. And I also once co-authored a superb OWL book with Alice Zhang on feature engineering. But these days I'm most referred to most frequently in a day as Mama. I also once served in the US Navy. Full picture of things that you want to be able to work with. And Salona, I know we can't click on side links, that's fine. I'll share this again at the end. I realize we are halfway through the day, so we just want to make sure that we've already talked about what is open source at least once. And I want to emphasize here that we do support the standardized definition of open source. It's maintained by the Open Source Initiative, which focuses on how software is distributed and licensed, as well as what you can and cannot do with software and still call it open source. And with that in mind, when we talk about open source at Google, we do talk about more than license and distribution rules. This open concept continues to evolve to represent frameworks that shape how software is created, released, distributed, as well as the communities themselves and how they form around projects. So when I talk about open source in this talk, please remember this is shorthand for that expanded framework. Which includes software that's licensed with an approved software license, as well as being developed using other open concepts. I just want to make sure we're clear here that we are talking about the definition itself, but we do use broader terms to simplify, not going through every form of open. We're going to talk about open source and the broader context. And the reason we use this wider framework is really because it gives us space to consider open source as ecosystems and socio-technical systems, rather than just systems of compliance within our organizations. So today, as we discuss open source and the impact it has within your organization, we're going to expand the kinds of systems we focus on, as well as the tools we use to measure our impact on those kinds of systems. And the reason we do this is because, as Deb was previously talking about, understanding things beyond technical systems do evolve over time, and so do their supporting and adjacent teams. And so your organization, whether you're a business, academia, nonprofits, you may be faced with challenges such as creating a common strategy for different licenses that might impact your intellectual property plans. You may need to make sure that folks on your teams know who to ask questions to when they want to know what the rules are. And so when these kinds of policies and strategies and guidance are not centralized, it does become challenging to ensure common practices across complex team structures. And so here's where we have found open source programs offices to be helpful. So OSPOs, or open source programs offices, form to meet the needs of an organization and evolve as those needs change over time. So if you are considering forming a new OSPO, I would highly encourage you to examine what your organization specifically needs, rather than forking or copying an existing team structure or strategy. The rest of this talk will focus on the kind of work that our OSPO does, which may or may not be the kind of work that you do in an OSPO. And that's okay. I'm going to explain our framework for thinking about open source programs, and those do not need to sit within a centralized organization for that framework to apply. So at Google, the mission of Google Open Source is bringing all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. And we open many of our internal practices and playbooks at opensource.google. Now, this mission is a little bit big. The value of open source is a big concept with capital letters. The resources of Google are big concepts with capital letters. And so now we have the question within our team and our organization that for all that we could be doing, what should we be doing? And to separate out the should from the could, we really lean into that capital P in OSPO, which is programs. We spend a lot of time individually and as leaders, as program managers, and as teams within teams, clarifying what we are working on and why. And so before you can get into that work, really using these frameworks, creating these tools, outlining stakeholders, critically considering the impact of your work, you and your team really need to be able to understand what we call the why and the how of your OSPO. And we always want to be able to answer a few specific questions about every program in the Google open source portfolio. So we want to know why we're doing our work, who we're doing it for, who are the stakeholders who care, and what is our impact on the business with this program. And so first, you need to know why you are doing this work. You may want to ask and document information like, can you explain why this program was created? What problems is it scoped to focus on? And we are very clear here about scoped to focus on, because you could be doing anything, but here you're trying to show what you are doing and why. You want to know if the same problems exist today that existed when your program or your project was first created. Where does your support come from? Where do your investments come from? Where do you get funding? All of this helps you to explain why you are doing things. And the next reason for that is because knowing why also helps you knowing who you are doing this for. So you'll need to know who a program is designed to serve. You'll want to examine questions like who are you designing for, and also who are you intentionally leaving out. So knowing who programs are is helpful, but these are only one subset of the people who are interested in the outcomes of your programs. Your organization may have a common definition of who a stakeholder is. And we throw the word around a lot, but we don't always necessarily mean the same thing. So I want to encourage you that if you do have a common definition within your wider organization, community, or team that you're working with, you should absolutely use that stakeholder definition and not create your own. And the reason for this is because it reduces context switching for people who you want to communicate with, as opposed to your needs and what your program is working on. If the organization that you work with does not have a common way to define stakeholders, you have options. Many of them are listed here. There's a few different philosophies on this. So pick one that works best for your program, clearly document that choice, and then we'll move on to the next part, which is once you know what a stakeholder looks like for your organization, you can start to unpeel the onion of exactly who those stakeholders actually are. And you'll want to consider, instead of defining stakeholders by name, really think about them more either by aspects such as their position in relation to your team, the role that they hold, the team that they're a part of, the organization that they're a part of, a business partnership to you. So this is more about understanding the relationships and the things that concern them, and less about the person individually, which can be a consideration as you're planning, but really is probably driven by these larger incentives. And all of this work that we're doing to do this definition and this thinking and this clarification really serves multiple purposes. So by documenting the why of your work and who cares about it, you're also capturing who you should be communicating with on a regular basis. And this allows you all to define and clarify with expectations, the needs, your shared outcomes, as well as potential future opportunities for collaboration. This is all the essential work that you need to do to be able to track and communicate this business impact of your open source programs. And so we're about halfway through the talk. You'll notice that I keep talking about impact and not ROI. And this is extremely intentional. ROI is a very specific economic model that we found to be too simplistic to capture the complexities of open source ecosystems. So you can make sweeping generalizations and estimates about first order costs on work like code reviews, doing things like understanding equivalent hourly pay and time invested in a review. But this fails to account for things like social and community investment made by that same code reviewer to work with a new committer, to onboard them to the project, help them learn how to track down bugs, and other sponsorship work which cannot be captured by things like hourly pay and time. So for this, our recommendation is instead to consider business impact of open source programs. And to demonstrate this, we've shifted to an input-output model, which examines investments into a larger system and the impacts we can show from these investments. And so at Google, when you talk about impact is a very cultural thing. Impact always has the exact same formula. And we talk about this openly in all kinds of documentation as well. So impact is usually did X because of Y, and outcome was Z. So I don't have it here, but the idea is really this kind of more understanding why you did something, having something to show for it, and then being able to explain qualitatively and quantitatively why that's important versus anything else that you could have done or could have shown. So for this kind of investment impact model that we're talking about for understanding business impact of our programs and our work, we need to do things like identifying and tracking investments. And this is everything from project funding, event sponsorships, employee contributor programs, and many more things. We also need to then start looking at understanding the impacts, which is all about how we and our stakeholders track, understand, and talk about success of these programs. And so tracking these more kind of nuanced investments and impact is not as simple as querying financial data. However, we can demonstrate this by defining useful program metrics and KPIs. So now we're going to talk about the frameworks our OSPO teams use for metrics and KPIs, as well as a few use cases to show how we put these into practice. So to start off with, I just want to really make everyone feel super comfortable with this word metric, which maybe you are or not. I know this is a very divisive term or polarizing term that can happen when you start talking in open source. And so here, when we're talking about metrics, I just want to settle into the idea that metrics are just measurements. They're recorded observations. And by themselves, we should not be making any judgment about a system or what's happening. And also to understand that observations are not unbiased. So what we choose to observe, the lens we choose to observe it with, and what we choose to leave out, all of these decisions will bias the outcomes regardless of our intentions. So we need to record design decisions along the way when we're designing metrics and be very clear as to the motives for observing and measuring. So if like the idea of metrics and data makes you a little uncomfortable or a little bit observed, we want to help you think about really metrics as an idea of your project or what you're working on as a scientific experiment. And we're not trying to think of experiments where we try to make something happen, but rather just kind of observe that system from a step back to see what is happening. Ask questions, be curious about the things that you could be observing. And then from there, start to think about what data you can collect that helps tell a story or gives insight into the things that you're observing. And so in short, there's a much longer talk on this that you can find. It's available at this link, which I will also post in the chat afterwards, that really dives more about thinking about moving into this concept of useful metrics and how you can look at a system and break these things down. So use case number one we can talk about for this is when folks in our team were starting to understand how can we measure Alphabet's contributions to open source. And so the lead author and project lead for this project is Sophia Vargas, a teammate of mine. So this is her work, and I did have her permission to present it here today. So this is starting actually in 2020. We started doing an annual analysis of what are the different kinds of contributions that Google has to open source. And a lot of this work is highly centered on this mission that we have of the dedicating the resources of Google for open source. And so number one, this impact analysis works really well because it is centered on the idea that we as a mission are committing the resources of Google to open source, so we're not having to re-justify that in any way. This kind of analysis specifically outlines the data samples of where the data comes from, as well as the evolving methodology that we're using based on those data samples and what we've learned in the last year. The last thing that I really like about this analysis of really thinking about investments to impact is that Sophia mixes both quantitative and qualitative methods as she's doing the analysis to explain not just the numbers of what's happening, but also why it's happening and what we can learn from that. So if you're interested in this, again, I'll share these links. You can find this more at bit.ly/Google-open source-2020 metrics. And like I said, we have one for the previous year as well. So moving from metrics into KPIs, what's the differentiation here? So we want to help you center on the idea that KPIs, key performance indicators, shorthand, are a very specific kind of metric. So they're really aimed to measure the pulse points that correlate to a process, a program, or a product being considered successful. And so in order to do that, you need to know what success looks like, both for yourself as well as for all the stakeholders that you work with. So knowing what defines success for you will really help you understand how to define a KPI, communicate it effectively, and know who cares about that KPI that's in your stakeholder group. So for this, there's a few things you can look to for that. You can see how you introduce your work to people to your work. You can look and see if you have a written mission statement, but really want to gain a sense of really what does success look like for a program so that if you talk about it afterwards, you know you're meeting your goals. Now, a little bit separately from here is defining success for your stakeholders. And the reason for this is because what's important to you may not be what is important to everyone else that you're working with, but you want to communicate success to them in a way that they understand, and also make sure that you're tracking that over time. So when you're asked at any point in time, hey, can you give me information about this? You're not scrambling for that. You're already tracking it. So here I give some suggestions and guidelines. Again, I'll call this out later about really how you can start thinking about teasing out what success looks like for people and translating that into KPIs, into metrics. So identifying your stakeholder, why they're important to you, how they define success in general, and how often they measure success and our progress as a program is all extremely important for you to know what kind of KPIs you need to be developing, showing, and also where you want to communicate that information at. Because if they're sharing their success in any place that is roadmaps or shared dashboards, for that, you want to be sure maybe it's useful for you to get into that as well. I also want to emphasize here that really how often and when to measure KPIs doesn't depend on when people want the reporting on them. What it actually depends on is how quickly things change. So you're making sure that you're observing things when they're changing, summarizing that and reporting on when changes are happening, not when somebody is interested in having a report. And then the last consideration as you're thinking about KPI design is really when we're trying to understand this timing or how or when. Just a few things to keep in mind is that KPIs do change, so success metrics do change based on how you group or compare things, how you aggregate them together. You want to keep in mind collection cycles of when you're observing, how you're observing, and also your reporting cycles, when to make public your observations. Because as things are changing over time, you want to make sure that they're not being reported on in ways that either look stale or in ways that aren't reflecting actual changes that are happening. Also, since we do work in socio-technical systems, privacy and security is a key piece you have to keep in mind here. You're working with people who are working in the open or reflecting people who are working in the open, and you need to be aware of the fact that your privacy and security, your needs also needs to reflect their needs as well. So last use case we're going to talk about today for KPIs. So I work with the project team, Cassandra Dillon, Teresa Terasaki, and Mariah Cruz. These are our lovely program managers who work on things like events and also knowing and how to work with events. So they have to be able to answer the question for their portfolios and the events that they work with. How do they define success? How do they track metrics for it? How do they show things for really socio-technical event systems, spaces, also understanding and knowing the ones that we choose to say yes to and the ones that we don't. So when we want to understand things like success for a certain program may be that they hold an event a month. My question for them is going to be, why is it 1 month? Why not 2 a month? Why not 5 a month? And then they can answer things like, well, we want to do 1 a month because that's how many we have budget for or constraints. And I'm like, that's great. Then you want to be able to say that we're holding at least 1 event a month as per our budget, or we are spending X amount of our budget. This is starting to change a little bit more of the business why you're working on it and just not naming the metric itself. So giving metrics plus context, that's what helps create the KPI in this sense. So we worked together on a few different things. One of the ways that we went through, because Cass, Teresa, and Mariah all have 3 separate kinds of programs, but they're all centered around an event. We were able to go through and talk between the 4 of us about where were there overlapping stakeholders and success metrics, writing up some common guidelines that all 3 of them can use for their metrics reporting, as well as really clarifying their individual program missions, which was also helpful because they were able to clarify that between themselves as to what they were working on and how they were different. That way we could create program-specific KPIs for each of them. So as they're looking and wanting to compare across programs, they're able to have this collective sense of metrics and KPIs that they can share and report on, but they can also individually call out how they're different and why, so they know they're not comparing things like apples to meteors. Hat tip Julia Ferrioli gave me that expression, and I love it. So I just want to take the time to really kind of re-emphasize some of the things that we talked about today. So we're all on this open source raft together. We know that the open in open source is about more than code or specific license, even though it's tied to this idea of license code. Managing open source in organizations requires good program management practices. It's not just technology management. It's thinking about how those things grow and scale that are around the technology as well. We want to avoid an ROI model to show the value of your investments. It's not the economic model we want to be using because it's not the kind of investments you're putting into open source. And also, metrics and KPIs are a reflection of what matters to you. So we want to encourage you to focus on useful ones that tie back to context and mission for your organizations and not are reflective of somebody else's organizations, unless they're a stakeholder, and then it's important to reflect them too. So thank you. Again, I will post the slides and the transcript, and I think we have a few minutes left for questions. And if not, I can stick around a little bit and answer questions separately.
All right. Thank you very much, Amanda. How about a round of applause?
Thank you.
And yes, we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anybody has any, please, by all means, post them into the public chat. That way we can see them and address it. I believe after this, there's going to be a break in this room, so there won't have to be a speaker handoff as far as I know.
That's not true. We have a BOF, a jobs BOF.
Oh, a BOF. Yes. Sorry, not a break, a BOF. Before we get that started, though, let's see what questions are coming down the pipe for Amanda. If we can just get link to the slides again, just one more time for folks to share, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Lots of clapping. I can see that, but I'm sure you can too, Amanda.
I appreciate it. And that is to a slides link, so you should be able to access all of the slides within there, or all of the links within there as well. So I do think I see one question from Byron to please clarify stake in open community code. Byron, can you tell me a little bit more about that question?
While we're waiting for the clarification, Heather's asking, do you have soft skills measured somehow beyond participation in metrics?
Heather, yes. So we are working on how to add quantitative and qualitative stories for that. So when we think about contributions to open source, we are talking about them in terms of the kind of work that is being done and figuring out how to start gathering that as data. So some of the ways we do talk about what could be considered soft skills is when we list people and their roles that they play in a group. We do list things like that we have people in board seats. We list that we have people who are doing financial work, leading committees. So we do list leadership as well. For soft skills for individual folks, that's a really challenging thing to track right now and like at scale. We can look at that more internally with Google because we have our own internal programs to track things like what people are doing on a semi-annual basis. So we can ask folks to contribute towards that in terms of like doing roll-up metrics. We also report things on like programmatic level skills. So if people are contributing to a certain project, we can talk about the number of contributors that we have, whether or not they were editing a paper, working on software code. So we are working on things for that. And I do have a separate project for that I can list in the bit.ly as well. So Byron, how do you provide value to stakeholders in an open community project? So communicating value to stakeholders in open community projects. So we do have program managers that work on open community projects that are not necessarily centered at Google. Excuse me. And one of the things that we have to be cognizant of for that is what are the organization or the community projects, what are their goals? So those individual program managers are given responsibility to understand the goals of their community, the goals of the projects, the goals of the ecosystem. So like we have quite a few folks who work with the CNCF. I always mess up that. It's, I think, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I might have gotten all the C's right, maybe not. But for those folks, it's a matter of, thank you, a matter of really understanding what's the CNCF's goals, what are the groups, what programs are we choosing to participate in. So if we have program managers that are in charge of special interest groups or are leading certain efforts, they have to really clarify those goals with that group and not necessarily with Google. So the idea for us is we put resources there, and then their goal is to identify and communicate back, I did this because this was the goal of the group or the working group. And here's how we know that that ended up being something that was useful or impactful. So a separate entity that holds a stake in the project, though not directly contributing or deciding what's valuable to the community. I mean, so separate entity that holds a stake in the project. I was describing what's valuable, deciding what's valuable to the community. I don't think that's what I'm trying to describe here. I'm trying to describe that projects do have their own governance bodies, as well as their own leadership bodies that we don't always have directly control over. This isn't always about explaining what's valuable to the community themselves. This is more about explaining that value back to our business. So how our business describes valuable may be different than how the community describes value. If that happens for too long, then it might be that our interests start to diverge and we may not be as involved in a project, but I think that happens in general.
And I think that's what Justin Flory's question was getting at a little bit as well, is tying in the external sort of community metrics from chaos versus like company internal metrics. Sort of how do you decide what those metrics are, and what are, let me read it so I don't get it entirely. Curious to know more about the balance between commonly defined metrics like the ones at Chaos and defining the ones that are tailored to your organization.
Yeah, so great question. So I think for Chaos, actually, Sophia is an active member in Chaos. And every now and then I like to drop in and put comments in different PRs because I have an interest in the project and just not as much time to contribute, but I do love the project. And so I think when we are looking at defining internal metrics, we do use things like the Chaos project and metrics community. One, we use it as a reference because we don't do every open source project at Google. Like, we are actually not that big. So there's the Google Open Source Programs Office, but open source at Google is much larger than just our programs office. So we do use this as a reference to other groups if they're looking at where to start. And if we do get to consult with them, it's something else that we can use as a starting point. But then also it also depends on what they have, their interests, their goals, and on really narrowing it down. And I do always recommend that teams and projects start with a very small subset of what they could potentially be measuring, because it's very easy to get out of hand and to try to collect too many things. And that creates actually more